guys, and welcome back to the Vanishing Hour. As always, I am Snow, and today I have another case for us to cover. So this one took a little longer because it required an extra layer of effort on my end, being that it is an international case, from which a lot of its sources were in a different language, so come through Google Translate. I did my best to only include information I felt was accurately translated and confirmed by multiple and/or reliable sources. I also wanted to get as much info as possible because, again, there just didn't seem to be a whole lot of coverage here in the States. Most of what I could find in English was just a basic outline of the events, so I wanted to go a little bit more in depth, or at least try to, so here it is. This case comes from Denmark. It is the vanishing and subsequent murder of Emilie Meng. It is a well-known case for its country. I did find it interesting to see the similarities and differences in handling cases here versus over there. And even like when analyzing behaviors of people, for example, what's normal here and there versus what's not. So this required me to keep an open mind and to look at the case from angles I probably wouldn't usually consider. Also, if I butcher any of the names or places of in this case, I am sorry. Words are hard enough for me in English, so there's little hope left for any other language. With that said, though, let's begin. So, Emilie Meng was born July 31st, 1998, to parents Helen and Nikolai. When she was 8 years old, her mother and father got a divorce. Although I couldn't find any information about this, it did appear on social media that her mother may have remarried and that Emilie ended up with a younger brother and possibly a younger sister as well, whom she was rather close with. Emilie remained in contact with her father to some degree, though, and shortly before her disappearance, she went and visited him when her grandmother had passed away. Her father expressed that he was sorry he wasn't around much for her, but that he did love her. Nikolai resided in Aalborg, which is about 200 miles north and on a much larger western, landmass of Denmark. You essentially have to cross a body of water to get to it. While Emilie and her family, on the other hand, lived in a small coastal town called Korsor, which is about an hour to an hour and a half southwest of Copenhagen. We'll go with Copenhagen. It's a smaller coastal town of about roughly 15,000 people. Cool little fun fact, it is also home to the world's oldest movie theater, which, according to Wikipedia, is still running. But yeah, it appears to be a quaint town where everyone pretty much knows everyone. It has a nice seaside area that, from what I gathered, is more like industrial or business oriented rather than recreational or pedestrian. I low-key tried to book a ticket on a ferry out of the Korsor port while researching a theory I had. And aside from the huge language barrier, I apparently needed to have like a business inquiry reference number in order to do so. I don't know if that's new or if it's always been that way, but yeah, that happened. So anyway, industrial port town was the vibe that I got, but it also had these cute houses in the suburban areas with slightly older looking architecture that was super charming. And then lots of rolling green overgrown fields and pastures and footpaths cutting through them and shrubbery and just openness. It's actually a really beautiful town. I'm detailing this because I want to really get the point across that this was, and it remains to this day, a really peaceful town with charm and laid-back vibes. It seems that if you were looking for more of a busy, populated, bustling scene, you'd have to travel inland about 10, maybe 12 miles to the city of Slagelse. This city seemed to be the main hub for anything within like a 50-mile radius. Emilie was actually a student at the Slagelse Gymnasium, so I'm assuming she would ride the train to school every day and would hang out in town until it was time to go home. Emilie was an avid social media user as well, and she oftentimes would post photos of herself and her friends hanging out at many places in Slagelse. So on July 9th, 2016, Emilie had plans just like any other Saturday before then to take the train ride from Korsor to Slagelse and to hang out with friends in town. Some sources said that this trip was to chill out and relax and essentially have a good time because they were celebrating having just finished exams and wanted to make the most of their newfound freedom. So they headed over to their usual haunts. This is where Emilie makes some of her last social media posts. One being a screenshot of her and her friend Nicole's Facebook message to each other regarding how Nicole feels equally accomplished when she exercises as she does when she's eating a whole pizza. Which I wish I knew that feeling. It's a sort of lovingly trolling post towards Nicole. This is later followed up by a picture of a flatbread pizza tagged at K-Town Bar and Grill. A quick glance through social media showed that K-Town wasn't just a place to eat or drink, but it was a real local hangout, especially for Emilie and her friends. People would hang out there for hours and talk and laugh and socialize, and that seemed to be what the girls were doing there that night as well. At some point after they finished up at K-Town, the girls did stop at a McDonald's. Some sources stated that while at McDonald's, Emilie did receive some disappointing news regarding a potential guy she was interested in. It wasn't stated that he was necessarily a boyfriend, but rather more of like a guy she knew and had been talking to and had expressed interest in. However, he told her he didn't feel the same way. Her friend said that she was upset, as would any girl turned down by guys she likes would be, but that it wasn't to like any sort of like alarming extent. She was hurt by the outcome, which is normal. So after a long night of celebrating with friends, sometime around or a little after 3:30 a.m., the girls decided to make their way back to the Slayosa station to head home to Korsor. Again, the train ride was roughly 10 minutes at most. Emilie decided to take that opportunity to try and charge her phone once they boarded the train, given that it was pretty much juiced out and the trains did offer a way to charge your device while you rode. She wasn't able to get much of a charge on it though, maybe about 15%, before arriving to Korsor station and deboarding the train at 3:53 a.m. As the girls walked down the station exitway, Emilie's friends suggested they all take a taxi back into downtown Korsor where they all resided. Emilie, however, decided that she would rather walk the maybe 2 miles, if that, back home. She insisted that, being that it was a shorter distance for her, because Lord knows my ass would be the first into the taxi, and that it wasn't a big deal. She knew the way, and it was now 4 a.m., meaning that the sun was going to be coming up soon, so it wouldn't be dark anymore. She felt that that was the route she wanted to go. Despite her friends insisting she take the taxi with them, they ultimately said, all right, be safe, and we'll talk to you later. Now, this wasn't completely out of the ordinary like it would be for some of us here. Where I live, that would be fucking nuts to do. People, especially young women, don't willingly choose to walk 2 miles home at 4 a.m. alone with a practically dead cell phone. But, again, this is a different country. It's different there. Remember, Korsor is a safe, sleepy family town. Violent crime wasn't this huge, glaring issue there. It was completely normal for women to walk alone anywhere and at any time of the day, should they so desire. Plenty of Danish natives claim that there are children like 4 years old riding buses alone into town like it's normal. It's not a worry there. Neither Emilie nor her friends had any reason to think that this would be any different than any other situation where they walked home. So with that, her 2 friends got into the taxi and waved goodbye to Emilie. Shortly after, some accounts say that Emilie either received a text from one of the girls or she sent one to them. The contents of that text unknown. But essentially that was the last activity on her phone before it went silent. Now, Korsor Station is a small, quaint little train station pretty much out in the boonies, so to speak. When I picture a train station, I picture a bustling-ass, busy downtown area with lots of neighboring businesses and buildings, maybe even some residential areas with plenty of activity going on. But that's not Korsor Station. It kind of sits in the middle of a big field-like area. It's a smaller white building with a single entryway that leads to a small horseshoe parking lot, and a single-lane highway passes right through the front. That also cuts through a giant green field area. Opposite the station, on the other side of the highway, is a footpath/bike path, which is very common for the more rural areas of Korsor. There's only 2 ways to get back to downtown Korsor where Emilie lived, and it would be either the highway if traveling by car, or this footpath by bike or on foot. There would be no reason for Emilie to walk along the highway to get home because it would have taken a lot longer. So, with that, she set off from the station on the footpath, headed home. Shortly before 9 a.m., Helen Mang, Emilie's mom, decides it's time to go knock on Emilie's bedroom door and wake her up and get things moving for the morning. Emilie is expected to sing in the choir at the St. Paul church her family attends in about 30 minutes. However, Helen finds Emilie's room empty. There's 0 sign that she has been home from the night before. And not immediately alarmed, Helen decides to call the church to see if maybe Emilie left early and was already there practicing with the choir. Helen is told that Emilie failed to show up for the rehearsal that morning. She then calls the girls that Emilie was out with the night before, hoping that maybe she stayed over there and is running late. Both tell her that the last they saw of Emilie was at the station where she declined the taxi ride and wanted to walk home. Helen says that in that moment, a sharp, icy chill shot down her spine. She knew whatever was going on, it wasn't going to be good. Helen contacts police to report her daughter missing. Like we've seen in many, many U.S. cases, the police initially felt that this was a case of a runaway, so they treated the case in its infancy as such. From what I gathered, they came to this conclusion after speaking with Emilie's friends from the night she went missing, and they had expressed that Emilie had been upset because of the rejection from the maybe boyfriend. Now, initially, you can't really blame them for considering this as a possible situation. Emilie had allegedly taken off to Copenhagen once or twice before. However, she returned home within hours. I don't know if that was of her own accord or because she was forced to. But if it was of her own accord, I don't know if I'd really call that running away. I picture it as more of a sneaking out if she didn't get permission type of thing. That's what I remember doing as a teen. It was never with the intention of running away from home. Again, that's solely my speculation, but it just doesn't sound like running away to me. Doesn't matter though. So, given this information, of course, yes, makes sense that this would be the route police would originally have taken, but their execution is a bit odd to me, which I'll get into. So, by the following day, Monday, July 11th, 2016, a search party of 200 people, including helicopters, search dogs, and even diving teams, formed and had plans of heading out in search of Emilie. Unfortunately, not long into the search, weather began to take a turn for the worse, with heavy rainstorms quickly grounding helicopters and eventually causing the foot teams to resign for the day. Their plan was to resume searching the following day, should the weather permit. Now, just to reiterate here, I did find it odd that despite the police believing this was more of a runaway situation, they were actively conducting searches within the first 48 hours of her disappearance. My assumption would be that if I received a case on my desk that I considered to be a runaway case, I wouldn't necessarily be bringing in diving teams and helicopters to locate her. I'd be tracing her phone, her social media accounts, checking her home for evidence of sorts that supported this theory, whether it be, missing money or belongings, a note, something. I couldn't find anything anywhere that stated these steps were taken. That's not to say that they didn't necessarily happen, but it sounds like the police were more into approaching it with a search and rescue, despite believing she had run away. But anyway, we'll get into that later. Now, Tuesday, July 12th, 2016, police have already stated that Emilie's phone has either died or been shut off shortly after leaving Korsor Station on foot the night she disappeared. Worried friends and family have spent the past couple of days messaging Emilie via social media, text messaging, and leaving voicemails, worried and asking her to respond and to come home. They are completely astonished when they see that Emilie is marked as online on Facebook and that she has seen their messages. You know, like when the little profile picture shows up next to the message, indicating somebody at least opened the message. That's kind of what they saw. This immediately sparked hope that she is safe somewhere and that is at least able to use her cell phone. Police, who initially confirmed to the media that there were, quote, signs of life on Emilie's end with this find, immediately redact this statement and shut down claims that this is proof that Emilie is alive and well. They say with affirmation that the activity on the account is not relevant to Emilie. This has concerned a lot of people and made them weary of information police have released, little there may be, up until this point. However, initially this didn't strike me as odd. It's common in missing persons and runaway cases, in the States at least, for people to see social media accounts and search them for information. This very well could have been what her friends and family saw at the time, and given its timing so early in the investigation, it would make sense, and it would also support why police were quick to shut it down. Why they didn't just come out and say that for clarification purposes is kind of weird. I don't feel like that would have been a hindrance in the investigation, but hey, what the fuck do I know? Now, if this wasn't in fact the case, what the fuck? Why was her account active? If it wasn't the police and her family who may have been able to access it via her computer or something like that, and they would have come forward and said, hey, it was us looking on there for information. But that didn't happen. So if it wasn't her family and it wasn't the police, the likelihood of it being her cell phone is pretty high at this point. So it could have been either her or her abductor. To this day, people do not feel the social media activity was explained thoroughly enough, and they want better answers from the police as to why they ruled it out so quickly, yet gave no explanation as to why. Police later come under much more massive scrutiny in their handling of the case early on, and eventually admit to several missteps and reasons, borderline excuses in my opinion, as to what went wrong. Throughout the following week, though, police and volunteers alike continued in their massive search for Emilie. They continued to cover ground via search parties, search dogs. They searched the water via diving units and boats, and they even searched via air with helicopters and drones. Emilie's family pleads to the public to come forward with any information that could help bring her home. They offer a massive 200,000 kroner reward, which, according to my calculator, equals roughly 23,000 US dollars for any information. Over the course of the initial investigation, over 250 tips and calls were received regarding the case. That initially didn't sound like a lot to me, but keep in mind this is a town of like 15,000 people, and a crime that took place very early in the morning when most people are sleeping. Any tips would be amazing considering those odds. So, also around this time, police receive an eyewitness account of a young man seen hanging around Korsor station around the time Emilie went missing, as well as a male bicyclist that was spotted in the area around the time of her disappearance as well. Both men are somehow eventually tracked down, investigated, and subsequently ruled out. By the time July 17th, 2016 rolled around, the search party had now doubled in size to 500 people. Police focused most of their searching in and around the area of Korsor and the route that Emilie would have taken home. On July 19th, it was reported that a, quote, suspicious condom was found in the area of a bunker in close proximation to Emilie's home. Some accounts stated that it was suspicious in nature because of the apparent blood found on it. Not much else was mentioned in regard to this piece of potential evidence. I didn't find anything definitive that confirmed its relevance to the case, and being that there was a massive rainstorm the day after she went missing, I lean towards the belief that it may be unrelated, but nonetheless, it was mentioned as pertaining to the police investigation and was collected by them. On July 21st, police resumed their air searches over Korsor harbors and canals. Again, the obsession was searching for a supposed runaway in bodies of water. Like, right out the gate seems odd. They may have thought this was a runaway case, but they treated it like a search and rescue, which is weird as fuck. But eventually, at some point, the police started opening up to the possibility that this was more than just a runaway case and that something else had occurred to Emilie. Police had received a tip that someone matching Emilie's description was seen walking across the canal bridge near the center of Korsor City the night she went missing. Because this would have been towards the tail end of her walk from the station, police had to consider that maybe she accidentally fell over the side of the bridge or was injured in some way. They took to searching the canal and the connecting areas, but were unsuccessful in finding any leads. Other claims, however, continued to come in, and this is just to name a few. A couple of eyewitnesses living in Korsor were out for their usual morning run around the time that Emilie went missing. They stated that they observed a white van barreling down the streets of Korsor like a bat out of hell. Being that the streets in that particular area were narrow, the joggers had to leap to the side to avoid potentially being hit by this maniac. Similar claims came in from other witnesses who claimed to have seen a white van at a store only yards away from the train station. One witness reported claiming to have also seen a suspicious-looking van on the Great Belt Bridge connecting both parts of Denmark, which happens to begin just a few miles from Korsor Station on the morning that Emilie disappeared. These leads, however, were never fully expanded on by police. By the following month, police had decided to expand their search for Emilie to neighboring areas of her route home. They retrieved several items of interest, including a bag and a torn shirt that resembled the shirt Emilie had been wearing that night she went missing. A few days later, however, they rolled it out as being part of the investigation. On August 7th, however, it was stated that another article of clothing was found by volunteer searchers and was turned into police. However, police refused to comment on the item and its relevance to the case. Then, on August 19th, police had received items of interest that had been found by volunteers around Korsor Station, where Emilie was last seen alive. However, once again, they also refused to release any information regarding what it was or any further details. Police rotated their search to the boglands of Korsor using sonar and more diving teams in hopes of locating any sort of evidence. They also expanded to 2 neighboring community gardens located southwest of Korsor Station and feet away from the most secluded area of Emilie's route. Again, they were met with nothing. Throughout the next couple of months, the police continued searching areas of potential interest, utilizing divers, dogs, and people on foot, scouring the areas by hand. They also claimed to work leads that they were receiving. At some point during this time, 2 people of interest began to emerge, although it isn't 100% clear on how. The most prominent was a 67-year-old man by the name of Finn Peterson. Again, not entirely clear how he initially came under the microscope in the first place. One source claimed that police had received a report of strange noises coming from his home the night Emilie went missing, and that he had exhibited strange behavior in the days leading up to her disappearance. What the noises or behaviors were, I do not know, but apparently this disturbed his neighbors enough to report it, and it may have been sufficient enough to cause police to investigate him 4 times prior between the time frame of when Emilie went missing and October 24th. But they had ultimately led to ruling him out until that day. So October 24th, things took a drastic turn in the case against Finn Peterson. Now, Finn lived in the area of, I'm going to butcher this, Tarnbergvej, which was about the halfway point between Korsor Station and Emilie's home, and she would have had to have walked through that area to continue on. The area in general had been searched thoroughly throughout this time, but on October 24th, police showed up at Finn's home armed with a search warrant that was initially sealed to the public but was later revealed. Police demanded to search his residence for what would be the 5th time because they had reason to believe he had something to do with Emilie's disappearance. The police essentially tore the guy's home up. They drilled holes into the wall where they felt he could be possibly hiding her. They ripped up floorboards. They pretty much turned the place upside down. But they found nothing that brought them any closer to finding Emilie. Finn decided to press charges for harassment against the police for dragging his name and his property and not even releasing the information that they had that fueled their reasoning for the 5th search in the first place. The search warrant was eventually unsealed and the media was allowed to view it. It was revealed that the police were acting on information they received from Finn's neighbor, who grew concerned initially when she heard yelling and screaming from his home and thought that it might be Emilie being held captive inside. The neighbor went so far as to take it upon themselves to drill holes into a shared wall between the two residences and implanted recording devices that ultimately were handed over to the police. A huge lawsuit between the police, the neighbor, and Finn eventually followed, and the neighbor was charged with violations of privacy and whatnot. Police were found not at fault in their verdict, but liable to fit the bill for the basic damages done to his property. Finn had initially asked for more, kind of like how pain and suffering, so to speak. However, he wasn't granted that. He was granted the bare minimum for the damages that were caused in the searches. Finn has spoken out on how the whole ordeal negatively affected his life, and honestly, I feel a little for the guy. He may be a little weird with regards to whatever shit was going on in his house to raise concern in the first place, but clearly it had nothing to do with Emilie's disappearance. Police never found anything incriminating, at least that was made public, and he has since been removed as a suspect or a person of interest in the case. The same, however, cannot be said for the other suspect in the case. His name was never made public, but he was described as a man who was from either Jutland or the Kolding area. I got differing accounts, but he was essentially a 33-year-old truck driver and had been known to reside in the Tarnberveg area. It was stated that the man may have come under scrutiny after a former friend of his became alarmed after a weird-ass conversation he had with the guy. Contents unknown, of course, and went to police with his concerns. Given the guy had a previous conviction of sexual assault against a minor, police felt this was a solid lead and seized the guy's home and garden. I guess he had a garden. It was later revealed in a search of his truck GPS that he was not in the area when Emilie went missing and was therefore crossed off the list as a suspect. Horribly enough, though, his same shit stain was charged with the sexual assault of a 9-year-old girl a mere 2 years later in 2018. Now, the lack of resolve in Emilie's case began to create a sort of unsettling feeling in the town. It no longer felt safe to send your kids alone anywhere. Parents began requiring their teens to either take taxis or secure other forms of transportation in order to remain safe. Eventually, a local neighborhood watch on steroids type of group showed up on the scene called the Night Ravens. The Night Ravens began patrolling streets on bicycles and setting up sentinels at places like Korsor Station, known for its unwanted solicitation between young men and women. The group went so far as to stake out a house of a Korsor resident they believed was a culprit in Emilie's disappearance. They set up surveillance on the guy's house and publicly accused him of holding Emilie hostage. By this point, police got wind of their actions and had to step in and control the situation a bit. Ultimately, though, the Night Ravens conceded and they cooled their heels a bit. The search for the missing Emilie Meng took a devastating turn for the worse, though, on December 24th, 2016, a little over 5 months after she went missing that fateful summer night. Christmas Eve, late afternoon, about 4 p.m., a passerby was out walking their dog in the area of Regnemarksbach, a dirt back road running parallel that is about 1.5 miles long and roughly 38 miles east of Korsor, just south of the town Borup. A much smaller town, a much more rural town of only maybe 5,000 people. The dog walker was out enjoying the beautiful scenery of marshy lakes and shrubbery when they spotted what appeared to be a floating body in the water. They called police, who showed up and retrieved the body from the water. The next day, on Christmas, the body was confirmed to be that of Emilie Meng. The only information that police would release at the time was that she had been a victim of a violent homicide. However, the manner in which she was murdered was not released, not even to her family. They also stated that Emilie was more than likely placed into the lake on or shortly after she was murdered, around July 10th, 2016. On December 29th, 2016, 4,000 people gathered at Korsor Station in remembrance of Emilie. The mass led a torchlit procession from Korsor Station to St. Paul Church, where Emilie was to sing the day she disappeared. The tragic turnout of this case really shook the quiet town of Korsor to its core. People could not fathom the idea that one of their own was taken in such a violent way, and that the perpetrator of this crime was still walking around free, potentially among them. Many were quoted saying, "Things like this just don't happen here, ever." After the recovery of Emilie Meng's body, the tips and calls regarding the case began to flow in again. This time in reference to the area where she was found. Initially, nobody felt the need to report suspicious activity in that area, some 30 plus miles away prior, but given the discovery, it refreshed old recounts of what they once remembered seeing that night. Police stated that they received an additional 250 leads after the discovery of Emilie's body. They also now decided to run a search of cell phones that were in the vicinity of Korsor Station and the lake where Emilie was found within the time frame of when she went missing. Police stated that they had about 200 numbers to comb over and look for any similarities or patterns in travel. Tuesday, January 19th, 2017, police officially released Emilie's body back to her family so that she can be properly buried. A service and burial takes place at St. Paul Church, where Emilie once attended, and where many have since gathered in mourning of her passing. The service held remained private for family and friends only. A few months pass with little to no new information being released regarding the case. And then on March 22nd, 2017, police arrive at the Motalaveg neighborhood, a crucial and contentious area of the route Emilie was supposed to take home that night. It is stated that a possible clue is what brought police to the location that houses several apartment buildings. It also looks like it's kind of a more seedier area of town. Again, I am basing this solely on pictures, so I could be completely wrong. But it's right on the outskirts of the big open field where Korsor Station was located. Anyway, police bring in search dogs and are witnessed digging up the green grassland that borders one particular apartment building area. They finish the excavation of the area, but they never publicly release any information as to why they were there or whether the clue that allegedly led them there in the first place was substantiated by any findings there. The following month, on June 20th, 2017, the tight-lipped police finally make the decision to release a new lead in the investigation to the public. Surveillance video images from Korsor Station the morning Emilie departed from there were received by police. Therefore, we're going to just start that all over again because that was dog shit. Okay. The following month, on June 20th, 2017, the tight-lipped police finally make the decision to release a new lead in the investigation. They apparently received video surveillance images from Korsor Station that morning Emilie departed from and decided to create a video reenactment, which is the weirdest shit I've ever heard, of what they claim to have seen on the video surveillance. They release their version of the video. In the distance, a dark-colored vehicle is seen driving past the front of the Korsor Station. They claim that this is essentially what they saw on the footage, only it was a light-colored, most likely white, possible Hyundai i30 series or a very similar model. They say the car is seen circling the horseshoe parking lot before passing in front of the front doors at 4:07 a.m., which is mere minutes after Emily and her friends have arrived at the station. After they release this lead, not even 24 hours later, police receive 100 new possible tips and information regarding the case. Police comment that while the new information is welcomed, they are all differing in nature and are not quite leading to any breakthroughs. Several days later, the police come under scrutiny when 3 very experienced investigators throw shade at the police investigation thus far and the handling of it within the first few days. The investigators say that the communication on the police ends, both with the public and with handling witness interviews and information, has been, quite frankly, dog shit, and that they demand answers as to why the investigation has been handled so poorly. They felt that the information that was originally released to the media by then head of investigation, stating that they believed Emily ran away due to being dumped and that her initial social media presence was proof of such, but then immediately redacted that information, was severely unprofessional and just one of many examples of their lack of professionalism and know-how pertaining to the case. The police don't really have much to say regarding these accusations, and they seem to stand by their handling of the case, stating that solving this has and remains at their forefront. Months pass with no new information once again. Then, in October of 2017, the white Hyundai lead is ignited once more. A new witness comes forward stating that she spotted the white Hyundai pulled off the road near Regnemarksbach area just a few hours after Emily went missing. Obviously, at the time, she wasn't aware of her disappearance, but given the recent police information released regarding the car, the woman says her memory seemed to have been jogged, and she could remember driving down that highway behind a tractor that early morning. She also remembered spotting the white vehicle pulled off onto the mouth of Regnemark and that the tailgate was open. She saw an unidentified man who appeared to be carrying something heavy. Police felt this was an extremely strong lead and decided to make another reenactment and release the images to the public in hopes of jogging the memory of the tractor driver or anyone else who could have possibly witnessed the scene at the time. There, however, didn't seem to be much movement in the case from this. I find the video reenactments or the photo reenactments a little odd. I feel like unless you're using like the exact same make and model, which they weren't, it can kind of be like confusing for some people and maybe give like mixed information. I've never personally heard of video reenactments being released to the public in order to help a case. I've usually just have heard of like the actual video surveillance being released. But again, this is a different country. I don't know the beginnings of how they work cases. So maybe that's just a common thing there. Anyway. Strangely enough, though, on October 24th, 2017, a burglary was reported at the home base of the neighborhood watch group, the Night Ravens. You remember them. The place didn't have anything of monetary value taken. It really only showed signs of someone rifling through paperwork and whatnot. But what made this concerning was what was found to be taken. Now, back when the Night Ravens were avidly working on locating Emilie Meng about a year prior and were neighborhood patrolling and whatnot, they decided to perform door knocks in all of the neighboring areas where Emilie Meng was allegedly walking home. They took down names and information and observations that they had. They kept that information stored in their headquarters where it remained until the day of the break-in. That information was the only thing stolen from the place. Now, I don't know about you, but that felt like a big fat fucking red flag to me. I was unfortunately limited in my ability to find any further information pertaining to this that was accessible to me. being that I am not living in Denmark. But it had me wondering a few things. For example, what was in there that could possess someone to steal it like a year later after the body had been found and the case was essentially at a standstill? Also, how would you know it still existed and where to look for it? The whole thing is very unsettling. The fact that I couldn't find more was even more unsettling, but it is briefly mentioned in the mini Danish documentary by 112 News on YouTube titled Mystery of Emilie Meng 2 years after. In June of 2019, though, the case took a huge blow when the investigators working the case and it finally admitted several crucial issues that had been identified in the information and handling of the Emilie Meng disappearance turned homicide. Police stated that there was more than likely a discrepancy in the cell phone information received and utilized during the early days of the investigation. They didn't delve into much detail on what exactly the issue was, but they did state that there were errors found in the teledata that had been included in the investigation. Emily's case was in fact one of the cases that led the police to discovering the errors in telecommunications information, which had now led to not only her case being completely reevaluated, but now 10,000 other unrelated cases involving telecommunications as well, which is explosive in and of itself. But to add the cherry on top of the shit sundae, police openly admit that, quote, certain investigative steps were not taken in the startup phase because it was assessed that Emilie had run away from home, end quote. The police are then accused of not properly collecting any surveillance video footage from any of the train stations on the night of the disappearance or any other further surveillance that could have been located on the route Emilie took in a timely manner. They are accused of only attempting to acquire footage much later in the investigation when most of it had already been either overridden or lost. Police refused to comment on when exactly they had obtained the video surveillance footage, further feeding these claims. I mean, it's just getting worse and worse at this point. When reading about this case, my first thought went to surveillance cameras. Whether she was a runaway, had an accident, or was abducted, I feel like that would 100% be the route to go. Now, I know that Denmark is not the US, and it sounds like they don't have a camera on every corner in every part of the country like we pretty much do here, mainly because they probably haven't felt they needed to. But Emilie's father has since pressed the issue that there should be more surveillance within the country to help deter crimes, especially of this nature, and to help solve those that do happen. He has voiced that he feels proper surveillance footage and collection of that said footage would have had his daughter's case solved by now, and honestly, I agree with that. Now, around the time of this bombshell that was released by police, something else rather strange happened. A very creepy and ominous letter was delivered to the doorstep of popular news outlet Berlingske Media. I think I got that. The letter was from an anonymous source that claimed to have vital information on Emilie's case. The newspaper claims the 2-page letter details a lot of additional information that has not been made public whatsoever. The letter was subsequently handed over to authorities, where it has seemingly been hushed over since. There's been no further mention of the ominous letter from the police. What little I could find pertaining to this, though, required me to sign up for a subscription, which I would have gladly done, but it requires you to have a Norwegian phone number, which I do not have, so I was not able to pursue this further. But damn what I wouldn't give to know what was in that letter. January of 2020 brought the case back into the forefront when it was made public that for the last 6 months, police had been going around the neighborhoods of not only the Matalaveg, the apartment building area where they were seen digging up grass and was right on the path where Emilie would have walked home, but also in Borup and the surrounding areas of the lake where Emilie was found. And they've essentially been knocking on doors asking for males to submit their DNA profiles. Now, I can only think of one reason why you collect DNA samples from people. And that is to compare it to a sample that you already have. Now, police have been questioned about this thoroughly, and they dance around an answer every time. The spokesperson for the investigation simply states that DNA collection is nothing new in a homicide investigation. It doesn't mean anything new, and it is simply a part of protocol. I mean, yeah, sure, I guess. If you collect it, it's usually because you either have the sample to compare to again, or you expect to have one at some point. By this point, it had been, 4 years? I don't think we're expecting to receive a sample from the crime scene at this point. You either have a comparison sample or you don't. I can't imagine it being a sample from the body, given that they stated that they suspect she had been put there shortly after she went missing, which means she would have been in the water for, over 5 months. I would find it astonishing for foreign DNA to survive the elements and the decomp for 5 months and be sufficient for comparison. I'm not an expert, though, but that's just my assumption. But it does make you wonder, if that's not the case, did they find it maybe somewhere else? I mean, we have that weird condom, which was also subjected to the elements briefly before being found. We have objects that were allegedly located at the last known location that police refused to comment on. I mean, there's just no telling, really. But anyway, they're door knocking for DNA, and it's not for everyone either. There does seem to be a specific people they are targeting. Some are more willing to submit, while others are just a little confused and wondering how legal this is. When they question the police and tell them that they're not sure how legal this is, police fire back with, you either give it voluntarily or you'll be forced to give it via court order. At that point, what do you do? Unless you're lucky enough to be a lawyer and can find a way to bite back at them. So, it makes me wonder, if you do have a DNA profile to compare, it does make sense to pull DNA from the area in which she was found. This area wasn't a pit stop off of a main highway that you would spot, nor was it some grand town people would know well. You take one look at the location, and it is blatantly obvious that this was chosen because someone knew of it. This wasn't a chance dump. Someone snatched poor Emilie up, did what they did, and thought of this place to bring her. The location where she was found is so crucial to this investigation, in my opinion. June 2020. I said that weird. June 2020, a book titled Emilie Meng, The Mystery, The Girl Who Disappeared, by authors Bo Nordstrom and Jesper Larsen, was released. The book detailed the investigation, but brought to light several alleged eyewitnesses who claimed to have been brushed off by police when they reported what they had heard or saw the night Emilie went missing. One of the witnesses, a young female, claims she was in bed next to her mother in the early morning hours of July 10th, 2016, when she, quote, heard a loud, shrill cry emitted by the full force of the lungs, end quote. She said immediately after she heard a male voice, but she could not make out what that male voice was saying. She subsequently wrote it off, considering she didn't hear anything further. Later on that day, when she heard the news of Emilie missing, God almighty, she immediately called police and reported the scream she heard earlier. However, she says in the book that she was, quote, swept off the field by police and never heard from them again after she filed the claim. She, however, is not the only one who claimed to have heard the scream that morning. A developmentally disabled resident living in an assisted living area near Motalaveg had also reported hearing the scream as well on several occasions, but he was never followed up with either. However, this was not the only tip that was properly followed up with. This next one made my skin crawl a little when I read it. A woman by the name of Karina Jensen claimed that she and a coworker had been driving on Vestry Ringvej, sorry if I butchered the crap out of that, which runs perpendicular to Regnemark Bach, the dirt road that the lake Emilie was found in is accessible from. She says that at about 11:30 p.m. Sunday night, about 20 hours after Emilie had gone missing, she spotted a large white van parked in a parking lot at Regnemark Bach. Sorry, that's my child in the background. She said that the headlights were on and the van was rocking side to side vigorously. She couldn't actually see anyone in the vehicle, but she didn't need to know that someone was in there to know what was going on. The book was quoted saying that, quote, what they were doing looked like something that belonged in the bedroom, not on a remote country road. I read that and, like, my stomach just dropped into my ass for some reason. Obviously, there's no way of knowing if it was even relevant, but given the other sightings of the white van, the location, and the timing of it all, it just made me feel like shitting my stomach out. You know, that terrifying, horrible gut feeling. Anyways, Karina says she continued on past the vehicle and dropped her coworker off before turning around and heading back the way she came. The van was still there, only it wasn't shaking back and forth anymore. She did her best to try and glance into it as she passed by, but she saw nothing or no one. She continued on and never gave the incident much thought until she heard the police announce months later the inquiry into the white van after Emilie had been discovered in the lake. She says she instantly remembered that night, even checked her work schedule for that time frame to confirm she in fact was thinking of the right weekend and was like, oh fuck, I'm gonna call the police. So she did. However, when the police reached out to gather her story, they honed in on her to confirm whether the van was white or gray, of which she wasn't positive, being that it was dark as hell, and the headlights that were on were kind of like blinding her enough to make it hard to decipher what color it was. She was also not able to make out which model or make the van was, and that eventually led the police to kind of wrapping it up and calling it a day on her tip. I mean, to be fair, they were dealing with hundreds of tips. If a woman calls in with a story like that, but can't even confirm the make, model, or color of the van, I can see them doubting the validity. We all know there are people who like to try to insert themselves into cases for some sick fucking reason. Now, despite all the tips, potential leads, evidence acquired up until this point, Emilie Meng's murder has not been solved. Several people have been ruled out, including Finn Peterson that we talked about, the shit-stained child molester who, at this point, I'd like to circle back to, honestly. But there were a few more that had sprouted up since then. Police also looked into a 42-year-old man that was found to own a white Hyundai that matched the one allegedly at Korsor station that night, and who was already in custody for murdering 2 elderly men. This guy admitted to the killings, but his MO didn't necessarily match that of Emilie's abduction, nor did she match his victim profile. This guy killed 2 elderly people. He stabbed them, and then he set their houses on fire, from what I read. One of them he eventually did actually take to a lake and dump their body, which is, I think, where police were trying to draw that connection. But ultimately, they had to rule him out. There just wasn't anything really substantial supporting that theory. Police also looked into the infamous submarine killer, Peter Madsen. Madsen was found guilty of murdering Swedish journalist Kim Wall when she was invited on board to interview him on his private submarine. This is a very interesting case, and it's a case that I plan to cover in the future at some point, so I'm not going to delve into it too much right now. But her murder took place less than a year after Emilie's, and with Madsen having been known to have ties to Korsor and in the area of Emilie's abduction, and driving a white van during that time, it was hard not to look in his direction. However, he too was ultimately ruled out as a suspect in the case. Helen and Nikolai both have expressed outrage in how their daughter's case has been handled. Helen ultimately had the reward money for finding Emilie donated after this discovery of her body. She refuses to address the media much, and it's a decision I respect. Emilie's father, however, has spoken out more in the years since his daughter's death. He has expressed his guilt in not being there for his daughter while she was alive. He says he feels he was a shit father for the most of her childhood, and just as he was starting to kind of pull it together, he lost her. He visits her memorial site regularly, though, bringing her a Smirnoff Ice and pouring it out for her, knowing she enjoyed them, as he sips on his beer and talks to her. He pushes for more surveillance in the country in hopes that this will help prevent the outcome of his daughter's case happening to others. It's just kind of a hard thing to see and read about, the fact that you can still visit her Instagram page and essentially see the moments in which her life kind of just stopped forever, frozen in time, yet people continuously comment knowing there's never going to be another post. It's just an odd feeling to see. Her younger brother is in a lot of her tagged photos, and it's kind of heartbreaking to see that his posts stop the same time hers did. It's almost like you can see the moment that whole family kind of stopped existing as they knew how. I don't know. I just kind of got like a lot of feels when I researched this case, being that I guess it's fairly recent too. There's a lot of aspects of it that you can relate to, and it's just creepy and sad. But anyways, that brings me ultimately to my thoughts and theories on this case. So this one was tough, with the extreme lack of public information on the police and their fuck-ups from pretty much the jump, and the media engulfing this, causing a lot of speculation and theories and baseless information. It's kind of hard to really get a clear-cut idea of what happened and to build a theory or idea from there. But there were a few things that I did note while researching that stood out to me, and I'm going to kind of go over those. It always stood out to me that Emilie chose to not take the ride in the taxi that morning. I know, again, it wasn't uncommon for people to walk everywhere, especially in Denmark, but there were statements made by one of the friends that said that Emilie kind of hemmed and hawed at the idea before ultimately saying she needed to take the walk. I get it. You've just been dumped. You're hurt. You want time to lick your wounds alone. Maybe cry it out where no one can see you and shit. I mean, that's literally how I processed everything during my teenage years, so it makes sense. But Emilie knew that in less than 4 hours, she would need to be at the church rehearsing for the choir. So why essentially waste an hour walking home? Cry it out later, boo-boo. It almost had me thinking she was either planning to detour or stop somewhere or possibly confront the guy. I mean, it's a stretch, but it's not impossible either. I don't know, but it's always bugged me that she chose to walk when she only had a few hours before needing to be at church singing. It's also made me wonder if maybe she was expecting a ride from someone and didn't want her friends to know. They say they saw her walk off onto the beginning of the gravel path, but I mean, my ass easily would have turned around and booked it back once their taxi was out of sight if I had any intention of catching a ride with somebody and didn't want to tell them about it. Who knows? It's just odd to me. But then again, a lot about this case is odd when it didn't need to be, in my opinion. The next thing that I chose to analyze was the route she planned to take home. Guys, I virtually walked all of this path that was accessible via Google Maps to get a feel of what we were working with here. I had to keep in mind that it was dawn at the time, too. If under any other circumstances, it is actually a really beautiful walk for the most part. But there are parts where it kind of gets a little like this. But I'll go over the whole path. So it starts out essentially in the middle of bumfuck nowhere at a tiny white train station in the middle of an open field. Across the way is a paved highway and then the beginning of a footpath or a bike path lined with gravel. The first 50 to 100 feet is gravel surrounded by thick, tall shrubs that line the gravel pathway and kind of also border the open bare field on both sides of the walkway. That's the extent of which I can see because vehicles are not allowed on the path, so Google Maps kind of fucks me there. But satellite images show the now dirt path continuing along. The shrubs fade away and it's just mainly an open path in the middle of a field for maybe a quarter of a mile before it approaches a cul-de-sac street that's actually paved with what appears to be an industrial plant nearby. The mouth of the path opens up to a sidewalk that lines another major highway. There's a tunnel that dips below the highway in order for pedestrians to be able to cross under it. That whole tunnel is lined with graffiti galore, and that's when the pleasantness kind of fades and you're in what feels like the seedy part of town. There's a lot of uneven, broken pavement and a curve in the street that leads you to the apartment blocks of the Matalaveg area. There's a few There's a few cars scattered on the street, and these bland, large apartment buildings that honestly give off this like ominous vibe. You kind of just feel like nothing good really happens in this area and you want out. Up ahead, though, is a local bargain grocery store on the left with surveillance. It's on the corner of a roundabout. You cut past the roundabout and you follow a highway paved nicely with more of like a middle class looking residential area. There's ample bike lanes, ample pedestrian sidewalks as well. And the neighborhood starts to turn around and look a little bit more inviting. There's several gas stations with also surveillance. And eventually you're downtown, as hustle and bustle as the town gets at least. You cross a canal bridge and you're in the heart of Korsor and probably not far from where Emilie lived. So, what I gathered from the walk was that even at 4 a.m. in the morning, the most likely area in which she was taken from was where the gravel path in front of the station started, up until somewhere near the Matalaveg street, which is about where the route just barely becomes populated. That whole stretch within there is pretty much unpopulated, barren, and there's not really any houses, there's not really any businesses, it's just open fields. It's also where the alleged screams were heard. My focus again would have been surveillance collection from the entire route so as to rule out where she got to versus where she didn't make it past. Obviously, I don't think there would have been much surveillance out in the boonies near the station, but the closer you got to Matalaveg, you could have easily pulled camera footage from grocery store, the several gas stations. You could have even gone door to door and asked residents in the area if they had surveillance cameras. I mean, this was 2016. It was, I think, a pretty prominent thing by that point. Whether this was a missing person, a runaway, or a victim of foul play type of scenario, I still believe surveillance footage collection would have helped support either of those angles that they would have been working at the time. So it kind of just blows my fucking mind that they didn't do this. Her phone is another bone of contention for me in this case, being that, at least to public knowledge, it has not been recovered. And with the telecommunications for this case being completely fucked, it has to make you rethink the Facebook activity from the day after she went missing. I'm not saying that it means it was her. If I'm being honest, I don't really think it was. An article I wasn't fully able to read because I don't have a damn account in Denmark that will allow me to subscribe to any of these news outlets had an eye-catching title that quoted the police saying they didn't know if they were missing an SMS message from the killer. Again, this is Google translated, so it might have been a little off, but for argument's sake, let's say it was perfectly translated. The title would indicate that police felt either of the phones that they were investigating within that area, they may have a missing one, or they could actually be referring to a message that was received on her phone. It had me kind of wondering and forming the thought that obviously the killer more than likely took her phone after dumping her, hence the activity on Facebook. If it wasn't police, which at this point I don't think it was, seeing as to some of the bumbling bullshit that they've admitted to on their end, I'm thinking it's one of two things. Either it was someone she knew who confiscated it to delete incriminating evidence on the phone, or the person attempted to log in to maybe try and send a red herring to give himself some time. It's a very common thing we see here. I've read about plenty of cases where, people's emails were hacked and, emails were sent to family members and loved ones for months before anybody really kind of figured out that wasn't them and something was wrong. However, instead, the guy maybe freaked out and jumped ship on the idea. But regardless, her phone had to have been picking up a signal if it was running off of data in order to access Facebook. So my question is, why were they not able to run searches on it to see what cell tower it pinged from or get a general idea of what her phone was doing when the social media thing happened? Because again, if it wasn't family searching her PC or laptop, it wasn't the police getting into her accounts looking for evidence, what else could it really have been except her phone? It's an intriguing observation, I think. Now, people have kind of suspected that in recent years with the testing of the DNA of the people living in the Metalaveg and neighboring areas where Emilie lived, that police may think that the perpetrator could possibly be someone she knew. It's also something I considered given the weird activity with her cell phone. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. I don't necessarily think that if it was someone she knew, that it was someone she knew well, or was like part of her close inner circle. But I do think it's possible they knew of her or that she knew of them, or possibly both. It would support the previously mentioned phone activity. It's one of two directions I'm keen on. The other direction is that this was a crime of opportunity, and here's why. Of the many tips that I read that came in, one that stood out to me was of a woman who claimed that she was approached by a man at Korsor Station sometime prior to Emilie going missing that night. The woman had just exited the train station and, at a quick glance, noticed a seemingly empty parking lot when suddenly a car pulls up out of literally what felt like nowhere. She says that the guy was offering her a ride to wherever she needed to go. She politely declined, yet he insisted. After multiple attempts, he seemed to get annoyed and kind of demandy, at which point her ride had arrived and the guy peeled out of the place. She noted him driving a white car. If this account is A, true, and B, relevant to the case, it supports the idea that there was a prowler out that night. It could be the Hyundai or van seen at the station at 4:07 a.m. that spotted Emilie taking the gravel path, sped through the city where multiple people saw the vehicle that practically mowed them down in an attempt to get ahead of her where the path opened up to a road, and therefore ambushed her there. This idea would also be supported by the screams that were allegedly heard. It would also match the description of the vehicle spotted 20 hours later by the lake that Karina spotted. This theory, though, would require the perpetrator to have a decent amount of knowledge of both Korsor and Borup. Whether he lived in one, worked in another, grew up in one or the other, or both, something. I said it earlier and I'll say it again. Where she was found required prior knowledge of that area. I also took a Google Maps tour of the dirt road. Unless you've driven it before or been there before, you wouldn't know that lake was there. You can hardly see it through the trees and thicket out there. It's not like it's right off a main drag that any passerby could easily see. At the very least, it would have required researching prior to dumping. There's so many places this person could have left her between where she went missing and here for me to think that this was by chance. There's just no way. They put her there thinking she wouldn't be found for a long time, and unfortunately they were right. I think lastly, the thing that stood out to me as odd was the burglary at the Night Ravens hub. For the burglar to take nothing of monetary value but to steal the logs of door knocks and subsequent interviews and observations from those inquiries is just unsettling at best. Who the fuck knew that those logs were still there? It had been almost a year since she was found and well over a year and a half since she went missing. Why were they suddenly relevant then? It has me wondering that maybe the person behind this may have crossed paths with either the police, the Night Ravens, or both at some point. They felt that the dots would somehow be connected at some point, given the information that was stored, and was like, nah, and was lucky enough to break in over a year later, find these logs, and take them. It sounds like some inside information was shared too, if I'm being honest. Again, this was noted in one source. Wasn't able to locate it outside of this source. Granted, a lot of the material on this case was hard to get, being that it required you to be a citizen to access most of it. Doesn't mean that there wasn't more regarding it, it just means I wasn't able to locate it. But that really stood out to me as well. Lastly, after everything that I researched and read and all the videos that I watched and the photos I viewed, there was one gut feeling that kept reoccurring, and it started pretty much from the get-go. I truly believe this guy was there. I'd bet my shitty paycheck that this guy returned. He helped in the search for her. It's just this nagging feeling I got almost instantly, well before I delved in any deeper into the case. It's pretty obvious that the people acting out of the ordinary got clobbered in Korsor. Poor Finn Peterson and, you know, the fucking shit-stained dude molesting children, and the guy patrolling around the area at Korsor Station trying to get women to get into his car. It seems like weird behavior will be reported, which is a good thing. This guy had to probably remain as normal as possible so as to not send up any signal. I mean, everybody was watching and following this case. I can't help but feel that he has been talked to already, that he's in the background of news coverage somewhere regarding this case. He's probably laid flowers or lit candles at her memorial sites. This is purely my opinion, guys, but I swear there's just this overwhelming feeling that this guy is literally within arm's reach. What are your thoughts, though? Let me know. Drop a line on the socials, and while you're at it, feel free to like and or follow. Videos will now be included in your Patreon subscription starting next month if you're into that sort of thing. I'm going to try it out and see how it goes. Anyway, guys, this was the Vanishing of Emilie Meng. Stay safe out there. Don't walk home from bumfuck nowhere train stations at 4 a.m. to lick your wounds. Just take the taxi. Also, let's all hope for justice for Emilie and her family really soon. Until next time, bye-bye.